I am 28 years old, a woman who has spent most of her life feeling like a guest in her own family. The feeling was never a storm, just a constant, quiet drizzle of otherness. It was in the way my aunt would praise my cousin Clara's accomplishments while mine were met with a polite, vacant smile. It was in the family stories that always seemed to start just before my father's branch of the family tree began. I had learned to live with it. I had learned to be composed, to be pleasant, and to not expect the same warmth that flowed so easily to others. I thought this was just my lot. A minor, manageable sadness in an otherwise decent life. The annual family reunion was the peak of this performance. It was held at my grandmother Rose's sprawling old house, the one constant in our family's geography. I always went because not going would be a statement, and I was not a person who made statements. I was a person who blended in. This year, however, something was different. The drizzle was threatening to become a downpour. We were all gathered in the backyard, a sea of paper plates and lukewarm potato salad. Laughter echoed around me, but it felt distant, like it was coming from another world. I was standing near the drink table, trying to look occupied by pouring myself a lemonade. That's when my cousin Clara, who was 30, approached with her mother, my Aunt Carol, in tow. Clara had always been the queen of this particular court, and she wore her confidence like a crown. She stopped a few feet away, speaking to a small group of relatives, but her voice was pitched just loud enough for me to hear clearly. It was a performer's voice, designed for an audience. "It's so wonderful that we all make the effort to come together," she said, her smile wide and sharp. "It's about tradition. It's about honoring our family's roots." She paused, and her eyes flickered toward me for just a second. It was a practiced, dismissive glance. Then she delivered the line. "Of course, some of us don't belong here, but we're all polite enough to pretend they do." The words hung in the humid summer air. The small group she was talking to shifted uncomfortably. A few of them shot me pitying looks before quickly looking away. My face grew hot. It was one thing to feel like an outsider. It was another to have it announced in the middle of the family's most sacred gathering. Aunt Carol placed a hand on Clara's arm, but it wasn't a gesture of restraint. It was a gesture of approval. She gave her daughter a proud, tight little smile. My own mother, standing a dozen feet away, looked pained, her shoulders slumping just a little. But she did not move. She did not speak. She never did. I felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in my stomach. This was the moment where I was supposed to smile weakly, pretend I hadn't heard, and melt back into the background. That was my role. But this time, the humiliation was too public, too deliberate. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of war, and I had come unarmed. I just stood there, clutching my plastic cup, my knuckles white. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. I wanted to run to my car and drive away and never come back. But I was frozen. And then a new voice cut through the tension. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of decades. "Clara," my grandmother Rose said. Everyone turned. Grandma Rose was sitting in her usual wicker chair on the porch, a silent observer of the family she had built. I hadn't even realized she was close enough to hear. Her face was calm, but her eyes, fixed on Clara, were like chips of ice. "That was an unkind thing to say," Grandma Rose stated simply. It was not a scolding. It was a judgment. Clara's perfect smile faltered. "Grandma, I was just making a general comment about family values." "No," Grandma Rose said, her voice unwavering. "You were not. You were speaking about someone in particular, and you were wrong." Aunt Carol stepped forward, her expression turning sycophantic. "Mother, Clara didn't mean anything by it. She's just passionate about our heritage." Grandma Rose's gaze shifted to her daughter, and the ice in her eyes seemed to harden. "Be quiet, Carol. Your passion for heritage has always been selective." The air crackled. No one ever spoke to Aunt Carol that way. She was, after all, the keeper of the family flame, the organizer of holidays, the self-appointed historian. Clara looked utterly stunned, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had expected her grandmother to be her ultimate ally. the matriarch who would surely endorse her view of family purity. I watched, still frozen, as Grandma Rose's eyes found mine across the lawn. The icy look was gone. In its place was something else, something I had never seen before. It was a mix of sorrow and a deep, simmering anger that wasn't directed at me. It was directed at them. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal, though I didn't know what it meant yet. Later that evening, long after the party had wound down and most of the guests had left, Grandma Rose found me in the kitchen. I was mechanically washing dishes, trying to scrub away the feeling of Clara's words from my skin. "Leave those," she said, her voice gentle. I turned, drying my hands on a towel. "I don't mind, Grandma." "I know you don't," she said. She walked closer and placed a frail, warm hand on my arm. "Don't you let her words bother you, child." I tried to smile, but I could feel it trembling. "It's okay. I'm used to it." Her grip tightened slightly. "You shouldn't be," she said, and her voice was fierce. "There's more to this family than she knows. More than any of them know." I looked into her wrinkled face, into the eyes that had seen so much. For the first time, I realized that my grandmother wasn't just a quiet old woman in a wicker chair. She was a fortress, and she was holding secrets. That night, I didn't know what they were. I only knew that Clara had finally gone too far, and in doing so, she had awakened something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. The comment echoed in my head for days. "Some of us don't belong here." It wasn't just the words. It was the casual certainty with which Clara had said them, as if she were stating a simple, undeniable fact, like the sky being blue or the grass being green. The memory of her smug smile and my aunt's approving nod played on a loop, each repetition twisting the knot in my stomach a little tighter. I tried to push it away, to dismiss it as just another instance of Clara's petty cruelty. But this time felt different. It felt like the culmination of a lifetime of small cuts. I remembered being 10 years old at Christmas, proudly showing off a drawing I had made. Aunt Carol had glanced at it and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to Clara and spending the next 10 minutes gushing over a lopsided clay pot she had made in art class. I remembered my high school graduation, where Clara loudly recounted her own academic triumphs, effectively erasing my moment from the conversation. I remembered my father's funeral, where Aunt Carol had spoken at length about the family's strong, unbroken line, barely mentioning my dad, her own brother-in-law, as if he were a footnote in their grand history. Each memory was a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that spelled out a message I had tried my best to ignore. You are less. You are other. Now, Clara had said it out loud. She had given voice to the shadow that had followed me my entire life, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. A few days after the reunion, my mother called. Her voice was hesitant, full of a guilt she couldn't bring herself to express directly. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked. "I'm fine, Mom," I lied. "That was unfortunate what Clara said," she continued, picking her words carefully. "She has a sharp tongue sometimes." "Sometimes?" I asked, a bit more sharply than I intended. It felt pretty deliberate to me. There was a sigh on the other end of the line. "I know, but you know how Carol and Clara are. They're very protective of the family legacy." There was that word again. Legacy. "What legacy?" I asked, my frustration growing. "We're not royalty. Grandpa owned a hardware store. What is this grand legacy they're so obsessed with?" "It's just family history," she said, her voice becoming vague, evasive. "It's important to them. Don't take it so personally." "How am I not supposed to take it personally?" I shot back. She looked right at me when she said it, and you and everyone else just stood there and let her. The accusation hung in the air between us. I heard her take a shaky breath. What was I supposed to do? Start a scene? You know how Carol gets. I felt a surge of disappointment so strong it almost choked me. "I don't know, Mom. Maybe. Maybe for once, someone should have said something." The conversation ended soon after, leaving a sour taste in my mouth. My mother's passivity was a form of complicity. Her desire for peace at any cost meant that my dignity was the price. I felt utterly alone, stranded on an island of my own while the rest of the family sailed on together. That weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. On a whim, I drove back to Grandma Rose's house. I told myself I was just checking in on her, but I knew I was looking for something else. I was looking for an answer to a question I didn't even know how to ask. I found her in her study, a small, cozy room filled with old books and the faint scent of lavender. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden. She smiled when she saw me, a genuine warmth that was a balm to my frayed nerves. "I was hoping you'd visit," she said. We talked for a while about simple things: the garden, a new book she was reading, my work. But the unspoken tension from the reunion was still there, a third presence in the room. As I was getting ready to leave, my eyes fell upon a small, dark wooden box on a low shelf. It was intricately carved but plain, with no visible lock or keyhole. I had seen it 100 times before, a silent piece of furniture in a room full of them, but today it seemed different. It seemed to pulse with a hidden significance. I reached out and ran my fingers over the smooth, cool wood. "I've always wondered about this box," I said casually. Grandma Rose's gaze followed mine, and a shadow passed over her face. Her smile faded, replaced by a distant, melancholic expression. "Some things are best left buried, my dear," she said. Her tone was soft, but the words held a warning. Yet, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of conflict that suggested she didn't fully believe what she was saying. It was as if one part of her wanted to keep the secrets locked away, while another part was yearning for them to be set free. That night, I was staying over in the guest room. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of Clara's words, my mother's weakness, and my grandmother's cryptic comment. Around midnight, I went downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark and silent, breathing around me with the slow, steady rhythm of age. As I passed the back door, I heard voices from the garden. They were hushed but sharp, laced with an angry, urgent energy. I froze, my hand on the kitchen doorway. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Aunt Carol and Clara. They must have come over after I had gone to bed. Curiosity, stronger than any sense of propriety, pulled me closer to the screen door. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, listening. "You have to be more careful," Aunt Carol was hissing. "You can't just say things like that in front of everyone, especially not in front of her." "Why not?" Clara's voice was defiant. "It's the truth. She doesn't belong. And what if Grandma starts getting ideas? You saw how she looked at her." "That's what I'm worried about," Aunt Carol snapped. "Your grandmother is getting old. She might get sentimental. We can't risk it." "Risk what?" Clara demanded. "That she'll leave the little pretender a piece of her precious inheritance?" "It's ours, Mom. Dad's father earned it. It's our legacy." My blood ran cold. Inheritance. Legacy. It was about money. Of course it was about money. But then Aunt Carol said something that made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. "It's not just the money, you foolish girl," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury I had never heard from her before. "It's the story. If Grandma ever decides to tell the real story, if she ever tells the truth about that side of the family, we don't just lose some money. We lose everything." My breath caught in my throat. The truth. The real story. What on earth could be so devastating? What secret was my family hiding that was so powerful it could unravel their entire world? Clara was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was low and venomous. "She's not even a real part of this family. If Grandma tells the truth, we're ruined." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I stumbled back up the stairs, my mind reeling. This wasn't just about petty jealousy anymore. This was about a secret, a lie so profound that my aunt and cousin were living in terror of it being exposed. And somehow, I was at the very center of it. Clara's words at the reunion weren't just an insult. They were a threat. A desperate attempt to enforce a boundary that they feared was about to be broken. I finally understood. They weren't trying to push me out. They were trying to keep a monster in a cage. And I was holding the key. The next morning, the house felt different. The familiar rooms seemed to hold their breath, charged with the secrets I now knew they were keeping. I found Grandma Rose in the kitchen, calmly sipping her tea as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis overnight. The casual domesticity of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. I couldn't pretend anymore. The time for polite smiles and quiet acceptance was over. I sat down across from her at the small wooden table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Grandma," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to ask you something." She looked at me over the rim of her teacup, her eyes knowing. "I imagine you do," she said softly. "I overheard Aunt Carol and Clara talking last night," I said, deciding that directness was the only path forward. "They were in the garden. They said things. About a story. About the truth. They're scared you're going to tell it." Grandma Rose set her cup down with a faint click. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired, as if she had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. She stared out the window for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something far away. "They have good reason to be scared," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" I pressed, leaning forward. "What is the secret? What did they mean when they said I wasn't a real part of the family?" She turned back to me, and the sadness in her eyes was so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. "It's a long and painful story, my dear. A story I have carried alone for more than 60 years. It's a heavy burden. Are you sure you want to help me carry it? Once a door like this is opened, it can never be closed again." Her words were a warning, but they were also a choice. She was giving me an out. I could walk away, go back to my life of quiet otherness and leave the ghosts of the past to rest. But I couldn't. Clara's voice echoed in my ears. "Some of us don't belong here." I had to know if she was right. "I'm sure," I said, my voice resolute. "I need to know the truth." She nodded slowly, a silent acceptance of my decision. But she didn't begin the story. Not yet. Instead, she stood up and walked into her study. I followed her, my heart thumping with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She went to the low shelf and picked up the small, carved wooden box. She held it for a moment, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns before turning back to me. From a small dish on her desk, she picked up a tiny, ornate silver key. It looked ancient. "This opens the box," she said, placing the key in my palm. Its metal was cool against my skin. "But you cannot open it here, not with them so close." She meant Carol and Clara. "Take it home with you. Look through everything inside. See what you find. Then we will talk again." It felt like a quest, a test. She was giving me the pieces, but she wanted me to put them together myself. "There's something else," she added, her gaze shifting toward the ceiling. "In the attic. Your grandfather's old business ledgers. He kept everything. Find the ones from the year 1958. There's a smaller notebook tucked inside one of them. Bring that as well." A new wave of confusion washed over me. What could my grandfather's 60-year-old accounting books have to do with anything? But I didn't question her. I just nodded. "Okay, Grandma." She gave my hand a squeeze. "Be careful, child. The truth has a way of hurting those who are not prepared for it." After she left the room, I stood there for a moment, the small key clutched in my hand. Then I went to find the ledgers. The attic was just as I remembered it from childhood, a dusty, cavernous space filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cedar. Sunlight streamed through a single grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. I found the ledgers in a large trunk, stacked neatly and tied with twine. They were heavy, their leather covers cracked with age. I found the one labeled 1958 and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with my grandfather's precise, sloping handwriting, documenting sales of nails, hammers, and paint. It all seemed perfectly ordinary. I flipped through the pages. And just as Grandma had said, a small, slim notebook slipped out from between the leaves. It was bound in simple black cardboard, and it felt different from the official ledgers. I opened it. The entries were not business transactions. They were a list of names, dates, and numbers. The numbers were small, amounts like $50 or $100. The names were unfamiliar to me except for one that appeared several times. Daniel. Beside some entries were cryptic notes. For the rent, doctor's bill, final payment. It felt secret, illicit. I tucked the notebook into my bag with the box. Before I left the house, I ran into Aunt Carol in the hallway. She was arranging a vase of flowers on a small table, her movements stiff and precise. When she saw me, her face tightened. "Oh," she said, her voice cool. "I didn't realize you were still here." I decided to try the gentle approach, to test the waters one last time. "I was just visiting with Grandma," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Aunt Carol, can I ask you something?" She looked at me with suspicion. "What is it?" "I've always wondered," I began, choosing my words carefully, "why Clara seems to dislike me so much. Have I ever done something to offend her?" Aunt Carol's reaction was immediate and explosive. Her back went rigid and she slammed the vase down on the table, splashing water onto the polished wood. "Clara is a good girl," she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. "She is a wonderful, loyal daughter who values our family's history. Perhaps if you showed a little more respect for our heritage, you wouldn't feel so excluded." Her overreaction was more telling than any confession. She wasn't just defending her daughter, she was defending a wall, a fortress of secrets she had built around her life. "I do respect our heritage," I said quietly. "I'm just trying to understand it." "There's nothing to understand," she said, turning her back to me to mop up the spilled water with a napkin. "The past is the past. You would do well to leave it there." The conversation was over. As I walked out of the house and got into my car, the wooden box heavy in my bag, I knew she was wrong. The past wasn't the past. It was right here, living and breathing in the present, poisoning everything it touched. And I was about to bring it into the light. The drive home was a blur. The weight of the wooden box on the seat beside me was immense, a physical manifestation of the secrets it contained. When I finally got back to my apartment, I didn't even take off my coat. I placed the box on my coffee table and stared at it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. For a moment, I hesitated. Grandma's warning echoed in my mind. Once a door like this is opened, it can never be closed again. Was I ready for what was on the other side? Taking a deep breath, I picked up the small silver key. It slid into a nearly invisible keyhole hidden in the carved wood. With a soft click, the lock disengaged. I lifted the lid. The box was not full. It contained only a small, neat stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a single photograph, and a sheaf of brittle, yellowed legal documents. I reached for the letters first. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to my grandmother, Rose, at her maiden name. The postmarks were from the late 1950s. The letters themselves were written in a strong, elegant script I didn't recognize. I began to read. They were love letters, passionate, tender, and full of a desperate longing. They were from a man named Daniel, the same name from my grandfather's secret notebook. He wrote of their stolen moments together, of his dreams for their future, of a life they were planning to build far away from the prying eyes of their families. He wrote about her smile, the sound of her laugh, the way she saw the world. It was a portrait of a deep and profound love. Then I checked the dates. My stomach dropped. The letters were dated in the months after my grandmother was officially engaged to my grandfather. Some were even dated after the wedding. This wasn't a story of a youthful romance that had ended. This was the story of an affair, of a love that had refused to die, even after she had married another man. My image of my quiet, steady grandmother shattered and rearranged itself into something far more complex and tragic. She had been in love with someone else. My whole life, I had been told the story of how my grandparents met at a church social and had a whirlwind courtship. It was one of the founding myths of our family, a story Aunt Carol loved to tell. It was, I now realized, a complete lie. Next, I picked up the photograph. It was a black and white portrait of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He was handsome, with a full head of dark hair and a strong jaw. He looked directly at the camera, his expression open and full of hope. On the back, in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, was a single word: Daniel. I stared at his face, this ghost from the past who had loved my grandmother so fiercely. I felt a strange connection to him, a pang of sorrow for a life he never got to live. Finally, I turned to the legal documents. They were dense with jargon, but the gist was clear enough. They detailed the formation and dissolution of a business partnership. The partners were my grandfather and another man. But on this copy, the second man's name had been crudely blacked out with thick, angry strokes of ink. The document spoke of a disagreement, of accusations of mismanagement, and of a forced buyout for a fraction of the company's worth. The final pages were a settlement signed by my grandfather, agreeing to pay a small, insulting sum to the other partner in exchange for his complete withdrawal from the business. It was a story of betrayal, a hostile takeover on a small, personal scale. My mind was racing, trying to connect the pieces. The love letters from Daniel, the photograph of Daniel, the business partnership with a man whose name was erased, the secret notebook with payments to Daniel. It was all starting to form a dark and ugly picture. My grandfather hadn't just married the woman Daniel loved. He had destroyed him. I sat there for hours, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. I read and reread the letters, stared at Daniel's face, and tried to decipher the cold, hard language of the legal papers. I took out the small black notebook from the attic and laid it next to the other items. The payments to Daniel started shortly after the date the partnership was dissolved. They were small, sporadic, as if sent in secret whenever my grandmother could scrape together a little money. They continued for several years, then stopped abruptly. Then I saw another set of entries, starting a few years later. The payments were sent to a different name, a couple I didn't recognize. But next to one of the entries, my grandfather had made a small, chilling notation. C's father. My blood ran cold. C. Carol. My Aunt Carol. The payments were being made to her father, my grandfather's brother. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My great-uncle, Carol's father, must have been involved. He must have helped my grandfather push Daniel out. The payments were his reward, his share of the spoils. This was the legacy. The precious family heritage that Aunt Carol and Clara were so desperate to protect was built on the ruins of another man's life. It was a legacy of theft, of cruelty, of betrayal. Just then, my phone rang, startling me out of my trance. The caller ID read Clara. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, but a new cold resolve was hardening inside me. I answered. "Hello, Clara," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "Where are you?" she demanded without any preamble. Her tone was sharp, accusatory. "Grandma said you left with some of our family's things." "Grandma gave them to me," I replied evenly. "She's an old woman." "You're obviously taking advantage of her," Clara spat. "You have no right to those things. They are family heirlooms. They belong to us." The sheer audacity of her words, knowing what I now knew, was staggering. "What things are you so worried about, Clara?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Old letters? Some boring business papers?" There was a split second of silence on her end, a flicker of panic. "You don't understand," she said, her voice lowering into a hiss. "You are meddling in things that are not your concern. You need to bring that box back right now." "No," I said simply. I don't think I will. You're trying to manipulate her, she seethed. You're trying to turn her against us so you can get your hands on her money. You're a pathetic, grasping little parasite. The insults, which once would have wounded me deeply, now felt hollow. They were the desperate thrashings of someone who knew they were losing control. I think you're the one who's worried about money, Clara, I said, the cold resolve in my veins turning to ice. And I'm starting to understand why. I hung up the phone before she could reply. The battle lines were drawn. She had started this fight with a single, cruel sentence at a family reunion. She had no idea that I was about to end it with a truth that would burn her entire world to the ground. This was no longer just about me and my feelings. It was about Daniel. It was about justice. The revelations from the box settled over me not like a blanket, but like a shroud. The world I thought I knew, the family I thought I had, was a carefully constructed fiction. My quiet, gentle grandmother had lived a life of secret heartbreak. My respected, successful grandfather had been a cruel and vindictive man. And my aunt and cousin were the gatekeepers of this rotten legacy, their sense of superiority built on a foundation of lies. I knew I couldn't move forward without the final piece of the puzzle. I had the what, but I didn't fully have the why. Why was my existence such a threat to them? What did they mean by that side of the family? I needed to talk to Grandma Rose again. I called her the next morning. My voice was low, heavy with the weight of what I had discovered. Grandma, I said, I've opened the box. I've read the letters. I've seen the papers. We need to talk. There was a long, deep sigh on the other end of the line. I know, child, she said. Come over. It's time. When I arrived, she was waiting for me in the study, the room where this had all begun. She didn't offer me tea or ask about my drive. She simply sat in her armchair and gestured for me to take the one opposite her. The wooden box sat on the table between us. Tell me about him, I said softly. Tell me about Daniel. And so she did. The story poured out of her, a torrent of memory and pain held back for more than 60 years. Daniel was the love of her life. They had grown up together. He was a carpenter, a kind, gentle soul with big dreams and empty pockets. Her family, who had some social standing in their small town, disapproved. They had arranged a marriage for her with my grandfather, a man with a promising business and a ruthless ambition they mistook for strength. She had tried to refuse. She and Daniel had made plans to run away together, but her family had put immense pressure on her, threatening to disown her, to cut her off completely. My grandfather, learning of his rival, had taken matters into his own hands. Your grandfather was a very proud man, Grandma Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. He couldn't stand the idea that I loved someone else. He saw Daniel not as a rival for my heart, but as an insult to his pride. So he decided to crush him. She explained the business partnership. My grandfather had approached Daniel with a proposition, offering to invest in his small carpentry business and help it grow. Daniel, trusting and optimistic, had agreed. For a few months, things went well, but it was all a trap. My grandfather, with the help of his brother, Carol's father, systematically sabotaged the business from the inside. They cooked the books, scared off clients, and manufactured debts. When Daniel was at his most vulnerable, they forced him out, using the doctored legal papers to make it look legitimate. They left him with nothing. They ruined him, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. They took his livelihood, his reputation, his dreams. And they took him from me. I was a coward. I let them. I married your grandfather a month later. The story was even uglier than I had imagined. It was a tale of calculated sociopathic cruelty. I looked at my gentle grandmother, and my heart ached for the young girl she had been, trapped and powerless. And the notebook? I asked. The payments? I tried to help him, she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. I sent him what little money I could, in secret. But it wasn't enough. He left town a few years later. I never saw him again. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Carol's father got his reward for his loyalty. Your grandfather gave him a stake in the business. That's where their money came from. That's the legacy they are so proud of. It was Daniel's first. I let the horror of it sink in, but there was still one more question, the most important one. "Grandma," I said, my voice barely audible, "why are they so afraid of me? What does this have to do with me?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken tragedy. When she finally opened them, her gaze was fixed on me, and it was filled with a love so fierce and a pain so deep that it took my breath away. "Because," she said, her voice cracking with the weight of the confession, "before I married your grandfather, Daniel and we had a child." The world stopped. The air left my lungs. I stared at her, unable to process the words. "A son," she continued, her voice breaking completely. "I had to give him up. My family would have been ruined. Your grandfather would have... I don't know what he would have done. I was terrified. I gave my baby up for adoption, to a good couple in another state. I did it to protect him, to give him a life away from all of this." My mind was spinning, unable to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. A son. A secret son. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. Her skin was as fragile as old paper, but her grip was strong. "That baby," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, pleading with me to understand. "That son was your father." The room tilted. The portraits on the wall, the books on the shelves, my own hands in hers. Nothing felt real. My father, my kind, gentle father who had passed away 10 years ago. He was not my grandfather's son. He was Daniel's son. And that meant... He wasn't... I stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Your father was not his son, and you are not his biological grandchild. You are Daniel's grandchild. You are the granddaughter of the man they destroyed." It all crashed down on me at once. The looks, the whispers, the feeling of otherness. It hadn't been my imagination. It was real. I was different. I was the living, breathing evidence of the family's greatest secret and their most profound sin. Aunt Carol and Clara's hostility wasn't just about jealousy or money. It was about existential terror. My very existence was a threat to their identity, to their precious legacy built on lies. Clara's words from the reunion came back to me, but now they had a chilling new meaning. "Some of us don't belong here." She wasn't just being cruel. She was stating what she believed to be a biological fact. In her mind, I was an imposter, a cuckoo in their nest. And she was terrified that one day everyone else would find out. "They know?" I whispered. "Carol knows," Grandma Rose confirmed. Her father told her on his deathbed. He was a weak man, haunted by what he'd done. He confessed it all to her. And she, in turn, told Clara. They have been living with this fear for years. The fear that I would tell the truth. The fear that you would claim what is rightfully yours. "What is rightfully mine?" I asked, confused. "The truth," she said simply. "Your heritage. The story of your real grandfather, a good man who was wronged. Carol and Clara have held their stolen legacy over your head your entire life, all while knowing that you are the one with the true claim to a history of love, not theft." I sat back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I finally understood everything. The constant undermining, the public humiliation. It was all a desperate campaign to keep me small, to keep me in my place, to make me believe that I was the one who was unworthy. They were trying to enforce a lie because the truth would completely invert our family's power structure. It would make them the outsiders. It would make them the ones who didn't belong. A slow, cold anger began to replace the shock. An anger for my father, who never knew his real story. An anger for Daniel, whose life was stolen. An anger for my grandmother, who carried this burden alone for so long. And an anger for myself, for the years I had spent internalizing their poison, believing that I was somehow deficient. I looked at my grandmother, my real grandmother, and saw not a frail old woman, but a survivor. "They're not going to hide it anymore," I said, and my voice was no longer my own. It was harder, colder, forged in the fire of this revelation. "You're not going to carry this alone anymore, Grandma." She looked at me, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a look of resolve that mirrored my own. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I stood up, my mind clear for the first time in my life. "Clara wanted to talk about family heritage," I said. "So that's what we're going to do. We're going to give her a history lesson she'll never forget." The decision was made. The secret had been kept in the dark for too long, festering, poisoning generations. It was time to bring it into the light, no matter how much it burned. I looked at my grandmother, and she nodded, a silent pact passing between us. She was ready. She had been waiting for someone to be brave enough for her. "I've been a coward for 60 years, my dear," she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "I let them build their lives on my silence. That ends now." She went to the phone and made a call. Her voice was calm and firm, leaving no room for argument. "Carol," she said, "I want you and Clara to come for dinner tomorrow evening, just the two of you and us." She paused. "No, it cannot wait. It's a family matter of the utmost importance." The stage was set. There would be no more whispers in gardens or cryptic warnings. There would be a reckoning face to face across a dinner table. The next evening, the air in my grandmother's house was thick with unspoken tension. It felt like the calm before a storm, a heavy electric stillness. I had arrived early, and Grandma Rose and I sat in the living room waiting. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say between us. We were allies, united in a purpose that was decades in the making. I had the box with the letters and the document sitting on the floor beside my chair. It felt less like a collection of old papers and more like a weapon. When the doorbell rang, my heart gave a single, hard jolt. Grandma Rose looked at me and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's time," she whispered. I opened the door. Aunt Carol and Clara stood on the porch. Their faces were masks of strained politeness, but their eyes were wary, suspicious. They knew this was not an ordinary dinner invitation. "Mother," Aunt Carol said, stepping inside and bestowing a perfunctory air kiss near Grandma Rose's cheek. "You sounded so serious on the phone. Is everything all right?" "Everything is as it should be," Grandma Rose replied, her voice even. "Please sit down." Clara didn't greet me. She just swept past, her gaze dismissive, and took a seat on the sofa. Her posture was rigid, defensive. She was braced for a confrontation, but she clearly thought she was the one who held the power. We sat in a tense circle in the living room. No one moved toward the dining room. This was not about a meal. Clara, ever impatient, was the one to break the silence. She directed her words at me, her voice dripping with condescension. "I want to know why you're here. Grandma said this was a family matter. You've been meddling, filling her head with nonsense. I think you should leave." This is it. The moment of truth. Before I could even open my mouth, Grandma Rose spoke. Her voice was not the frail, gentle voice of an old woman. It was clear and strong, resonating with an authority I had never heard from her before. It was the voice of a matriarch finally claiming her throne. "She is here," Grandma Rose said. Her eyes fixed on Clara. "Because she is my granddaughter. And it is time that both of you learned what that really means." Aunt Carol shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, what are you talking about? We all know who she is." "No, Carol," Grandma Rose said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "You don't. You know the story you were told, the story you have benefited from. Tonight you are going to hear the true one." Clara scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, here we go. Are you going to tell us some sob story so she can get a bigger piece of the will? Is that what this is about? Money? This is about a man named Daniel, Grandma Rose said simply. The name dropped into the room like a stone. Aunt Carol went pale. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, frightened mask. Clara looked confused for a second. Then her eyes darted to her mother's face, and the confusion curdled into alarm. I don't know anyone by that name, Aunt Carol stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Don't you lie to me, Carol, Grandma Rose snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. Not in this house. Not anymore. Your father told you everything before he died. He told you about Daniel. He told you how your father and my husband conspired to destroy him, how they stole his business, his future, and his good name. That's a lie, Clara burst out, jumping to her feet. My grandfather was an honest, hardworking man. He built his business from nothing. He built it on the back of a better man, Grandma Rose retorted, her gaze unwavering. He built it with the help of your other grandfather, a man who betrayed his friend for a share of the profits. The money that paid for your comfortable life, Carol, the money that sent you to college and bought your first house, that money was stained. It was the price of a man's soul. Aunt Carol was silent, her face a mixture of horror and guilt. She couldn't deny it. She knew it was true. Clara, however, was not ready to surrender. You're making this up, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You're a bitter old woman, and she pointed a trembling finger at me, has poisoned your mind against your real family. My real family? Grandma Rose said, her voice dangerously quiet. Let's talk about my real family. This was my cue. I leaned down and lifted the wooden box, placing it on the coffee table with a solid thud. I opened the lid. What is that? Clara demanded. It's proof, I said, my voice steady. I took out the stack of letters tied with the blue ribbon. These are love letters, from Daniel to Rose, written while she was engaged to the man you call your grandfather. I then placed the photograph of Daniel on the table, his kind, smiling face looking up at them. This is the man she loved. Finally, I took out the legal documents and the small black notebook. I opened the notebook and pointed to the entries. And this is the record of how your grandfather, with the help of yours, Clara, bled him dry. And this, I pointed to another page, is the record of the payments made to your father, Carol, his 30 pieces of silver. Aunt Carol let out a small, choked sob. She stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. Clara looked from the papers to her mother's crumbling facade, her own bravado beginning to crack. It's not true, she whispered, but the conviction was gone from her voice. Oh, but it is, Grandma Rose said, and that is not even the most important part of the story. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the silent room. She looked from Carol to Clara, and then her eyes found mine, and she gave me a look of profound love and sorrow. Before I was forced to marry him, she said, her voice clear and ringing with the force of an unspeakable truth. Daniel and I had a child, a son I had to give away to protect him. Clara stared, her mouth agape, her mind clearly struggling to comprehend the words. Aunt Carol just closed her eyes as if she could block out the truth. That son, Grandma Rose continued, her voice rising with every word, was a wonderful man, a kind and gentle man. Just like his father, that son was my son, and he was your father. She was looking directly at me. Then she turned her gaze, now blazing with 60 years of repressed fury, upon Carol and Clara. So you see? She said, her voice dropping to a low, devastating conclusion. She is not an outsider. She is not someone who doesn't belong. She is the granddaughter of the man you wronged. Her blood right in this family comes from love and truth. Yours comes from betrayal and theft. Now you tell me, who doesn't belong here? The final words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the seconds of their ruined lives. Clara's face, which had cycled through confusion, denial, and alarm, finally settled on a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The carefully constructed world of her superiority, the very foundation of her identity, had been demolished in a matter of minutes. "No," she breathed, the word a ragged gasp. "No, it's all lies. You're lying." She lunged forward, her hands reaching for the box on the table, as if by destroying the proof she could destroy the truth itself. Her nails scraped against the wood. "It's all lies," she screamed, her voice a raw, ugly shriek of desperation. "She's a gold digger, a nobody. She tricked you. She tricked a confused old woman into believing this fantasy." I pulled the box away from her grasping hands, holding it protectively. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was out. A living thing in the room now, and it was doing its work. Aunt Carol, who had been sitting frozen, a statue of guilt, finally broke. She let out a gut-wrenching sob, burying her face in her hands. "It's true," she mumbled through her fingers. "It's all true. My father told me. He told me everything." Clara froze, her hands hovering in midair. She turned slowly to stare at her mother, her eyes wide with betrayal. "What?" she whispered. You knew all this time?" I didn't want to believe it," Aunt Carol sobbed. "I wanted to protect our family. Our name." "Our name?" Clara's voice was laced with a venomous disbelief. "Our name is worthless. It's built on a lie. You let me treat her. You stood there and smiled while I—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The full weight of her actions, of her lifelong cruelty, seemed to crash down upon her. It hadn't been a righteous defense of her family's honor. It had been the desperate bullying of a frightened fraud, terrified of the very person she was tormenting. Her mask of arrogant superiority was not just gone. It was shattered into a million pieces, revealing the pathetic, insecure person underneath. She backed away from the table, stumbling as if she had been struck. She looked at me, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have a condescending remark or a smug smile. Her face was a canvas of pure humiliation. The color drained from her cheeks, and her eyes, which had always been so sharp and critical, were now just empty and lost. She turned and fled. She didn't grab her purse or say goodbye. She just ran out of the room, out of the house, and into the night. The sound of her frantic footsteps echoing on the porch before being swallowed by the darkness. Aunt Carol remained, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her mother. She just stared at the floor, a broken woman sitting in the rubble of her life. Grandma Rose watched her daughter for a long moment, her expression not of triumph, but of a deep, weary sorrow. "You chose your legacy, Carol," she said quietly. "You chose lies and cruelty over truth and kindness, and now you have to live with it." She then stood up, walked over to me, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was warm and steady. "Let's leave her," she said, her voice gentle again. "There is nothing more to say." We walked out of the living room together, leaving my aunt to drown in the truth she had tried so hard to submerge. As we stepped into the hallway, I felt a lifetime of weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer the outsider. I was no longer the guest. I was home. The air in the house seemed cleaner, lighter. The ghosts had been faced. The secrets had been aired. And in the devastating, painful wreckage of it all, I had finally found my place. The days that followed were quiet. The explosion of the confrontation gave way to a strange, echoing silence. The family, which had always seemed like a solid, unshakable institution, had fractured. The news of what had happened spread not in a single wave, but in slow, creeping ripples, passed through hushed phone calls and awkward conversations. My mom was the first person I spoke to in detail. She came over to my apartment the next day, her face etched with a mixture of shock and profound sadness. She had heard a garbled, hysterical version from Aunt Carol, and then a calm, factual one from Grandma Rose. She sat on my sofa, twisting a napkin in her hands. "All these years," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. All these years, I just thought Carol was difficult and Clara was spoiled. I never imagined. Your poor father. He never knew who he was. He knew who he was, I said gently. He was a good man, a kind father. That's a better identity than any bloodline. But I should have defended you, she said, her voice thick with regret. Every time they made a comment, every time they looked down on you, I just stood by and let it happen. I told you not to make waves. I was a coward. You didn't know the whole story, Mom, I said, though a part of me still felt the sting of her years of inaction. It doesn't matter, she insisted. You were my daughter. I should have protected you, regardless of the reason. Can you ever forgive me? We talked for hours that day. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. I saw not just my passive mother, but a woman who had been conditioned her whole life to keep the peace, to smooth over conflicts, to never challenge the family's established order. Her weakness was not an excuse, but it was, for the first time, understandable. Our relationship wouldn't be magically fixed overnight, but a new foundation of honesty had been laid. It was a start. A week later, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Aunt Carol. Her voice was a pale, hollow version of its former self. The sharp, authoritative edge was gone, replaced by a trembling hesitation. I wanted to call, she began, her words stumbling over each other. To say, I am so sorry. I waited, saying nothing. I was wrong, she continued. Horribly, horribly wrong. I let my father's shame and my own fear dictate how I lived my life, how I treated you. There's no excuse for it. It was an apology, of a sort. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't really for me. It was for her. It was the desperate act of a woman trying to salvage some piece of her shattered self-image. She was apologizing not because she understood my pain, but because her own had become unbearable. Thank you for saying that, Aunt Carol, I said, my voice polite but distant. I appreciate the call. Will I see you at Christmas? She asked, a hopeful, pathetic note in her voice. The question hung in the air. She was asking for forgiveness, for a return to a normal that no longer existed. I don't know, I said honestly. I think the family will look very different from now on. I did not offer her forgiveness. I did not offer her absolution. I offered her nothing but the cold, hard consequences of her actions. Some things once broken could not be pieced back together in the same way. Our relationship was one of them. The most significant consequence came from Grandma Rose. A few weeks after the dinner, she called me and asked me to accompany her to her lawyer's office. There, she made official changes to her will. The sprawling family home, which had always been destined for Aunt Carol, was now to be left to me. A significant portion of her financial assets, once earmarked for Clara, was placed into a trust in my name. It's not about the money, she told me later as we sat in her garden. It's about justice. This house, this land. It was all bought with the profits from the business your grandfather stole. It's only right that it comes back to Daniel's family. It comes back to you. For me, it wasn't about the money either. It was about the statement. It was a public, legal, and permanent declaration of the new family order. It was the truth, codified in law. The next family reunion was a year later. I almost didn't go. The idea of facing everyone felt daunting, but Grandma Rose insisted. This is your house now, she had said to me a few weeks prior. Her health beginning to fail, but her spirit as strong as ever. You must be there. You are the head of this family now. So I went. The atmosphere was subdued, a stark contrast to the loud, boisterous gatherings of the past. The elephant in the room was so large it barely left space for the guests. Aunt Carol and Clara were there. They arrived late and left early. They didn't mingle. They sat at a small table by themselves, speaking to no one. They looked small, diminished, like ghosts haunting the scene of their former glory. Clara, who had once held court with such effortless arrogance, now couldn't seem to meet anyone's eyes. Her crown was gone, and she seemed lost without it. As I walked past their table to get a drink, her eyes flickered up and met mine for a brief, terrible second. I saw no anger in them, no hatred, just a vast, empty expanse of humiliation. She looked away quickly, staring down at her paper plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. In that moment, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a satisfying sense of revenge. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. The war was over. The truth had won. I spent the rest of the afternoon talking with relatives, some of whom approached me with a newfound respect, others with apologies in their eyes for their years of passive observation. I learned more about Daniel from some of the oldest cousins, who remembered him as a kind boy from their youth. I was piecing together the story of the grandfather I never knew, my real grandfather. Later, as the sun began to set, I stood on the porch, looking out over the yard. My house, my family. The drizzle of otherness that had followed me my whole life was gone, burned away by the harsh sun of the truth. I finally knew my story. I knew where I came from. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I belonged. Clara and her mother had spent a lifetime trying to make me feel small, to convince me that I was the one who was out of place. Now, sitting in the fading light of a party that no longer revolved around them, they were the outsiders. They had finally learned what it feels like to be on the wrong side of the door, looking in. And I knew, with a quiet finality, that door would never be opened to them again. The legacy they fought so hard to protect was ash, and from it, something new and true was beginning to grow.